Now, tomorrow is the International Day commemorating victims of violence based on religion and belief. This includes Christians, Yazidis and Jews killed by ISIS in Iraq and Syria, victims of honour killings, and now the plight of religious minorities such as Shia Muslims and Christians living under the Taliban in Afghanistan. Joining me now, joining the panel, is Ryan Christopher, the Director of Alliance Defending Freedom UK, which campaigns for fundamental human rights. Ryan, if I can come to you right away, in my innocence, possibly my ignorance, I had assumed there would be by now no other faith but Sunni Islam in Afghanistan. But I'm obviously wrong in that assumption.
Yes, there are lots of other minorities in Afghanistan right now. But to be honest, for around 2 years, they've very much been in hiding increasingly. Lots of my colleagues have informed me about reports that they read from people on the ground or experts saying that Christians in particular that they're connected with have been going underground for quite a while as they've seen the end game coming.
What sort of numbers would we be talking about there? When you mention Christians, for example?
Yeah, we're talking about 1.5%. In reality, something around 2%. And we talk about, rightly, women and girls, the threat posed to women and girls with the Taliban and various other sections of society. What we've very rarely, I guess, focus on as much are these religious minorities and what the plan is for them going forward in Afghanistan. And we have real concerns that the exit plan for these religious minorities won't be sufficient, as we've seen in the past in similar circumstances, like in Syria and Iraq.
And what about the Shia Muslims? I think they're in the west of the country. What predicament do they now find themselves in again?
Absolutely. In practice, around the world where there's religious persecution, and that persecution is by Islamist groups or national Islamic groups, often it's Islamic minorities that suffer the worst in practice, and that's often Shia minorities or Ahmadi communities, for example. So I think they have, in some ways, more to fear in some ways, if they're seen as infidels, than actually some of the Christian or other religious minorities at times. So it's going to be a lot harder to, I guess, exit the majority of Shia Muslims from Afghanistan, whereas when you're talking about can you get 20,000 Christians over to the UK from the Afghanistan, and that makes a real difference to that community, then that's realistic. But you're right, the Shia Muslim minority could be in for a rough ride. We saw in the 90s when the Taliban were last in majority control, that it was Shia Muslim minority that bore the brunt of that persecution.
Was it just me? My instinct was that because of the nature of what the Taliban have been, that everybody else that wasn't sympathetic to them would either have fled or have suffered the consequences of remaining. Or are you surprised by the knowledge that those minorities are there? 20,000 Christians still in Afghanistan.
Well, I think there are many different minority groups in that region, and it is worrying when you do have a kind of dominant Islamist force who are incredibly intolerant of different religious minorities. And I think that is one of the things that I think is a consideration now as the conversation is moving forward, since this horrendous situation is what is our responsibility, if there is at all, in terms of resettling people that are genuinely persecuted, genuinely vulnerable. And I think that has to be part of the conversation in terms of what we can do in order to make sure that there's safe routes and safe passages for people to live.
How practical is it when we're dealing with numbers which run into tens of thousands and more? Is it realistic to contemplate relocating people on that scale?
I don't think it is realistic to contemplate that, given the numbers involved, given the number of countries, given that we have, this is going on also in, if you look at parts of Sahelian Africa, if you look at, there are 40 million some odd refugees in the world. I don't think resettlement in sort of high-income Western countries, some, yes. And the numbers that are talked about are typically no higher than the tens of thousands. So that will happen, and it should happen, and especially for those that have provided services to the regime, to the coalition. But I think there inevitably is going to have to be a discussion around the boundaries of who qualifies for permanent settlement in the West, and those numbers are inevitably going to be limited. It's just the nature. We can't take the kind of scale of the misery. I mean, the world is very unequal, and some people have drawn unlucky cards, and some have drawn lucky cards, and we can't really, if national citizenship is to hold, we can't really sort of right that wrong, that cosmic wrong in a way. So we've got to do something, and certainly for people who are very in imminent danger due to political belief. But I think we have to draw boundaries as well. That's important.
What do you think of that, Ryan? I mean, how do you realistically start to handle the numbers that are involved? No one disputes that help is required and you know, that people need that opportunity to flee. But how? What are the mechanics and the logistics?
You can't resettle everyone, I think, realistically, even if we'd like to. Again, I don't know how possible that is. What I do know is that previous attempts to deal with refugees that result from ethnic or religious conflicts, like we've seen in Syria and Iraq most recently with Daesh and ISIS, have been terribly managed by Western governments. And in large part, that's because the vulnerability criteria that we apply to people stuck in these situations, as Afghan, Shia and Christian will be, are often wrong or inappropriate for the circumstance. And in particular, there's often been a failure by the UN Refugee Agency and Western governments to recognise that religious affiliation itself should be enough in certain circumstances where you have the Taliban or you have Daesh saying, we want to eradicate your way of life. We're very open about this, as the Taliban have been in the past. That should be enough, with all of the relevant security checks and all the rest of it that needs to be done, to make someone vulnerable under the criteria and then resettle them. The UK government have said the resettlement scheme for Afghanistan will be like the vulnerable persons scheme that we saw from Syria. And to be frank, the religious minorities that made it across through that scheme were totally disproportionate against those that were most persecuted. So Christians and, again, Islamic minorities were totally underrepresented in those that actually made it to the UK. And again, that's the result of religious affiliation itself not being seen as a criteria with sufficient weight.
Much is being made of the fact that the Taliban at the moment are saying that they've changed. Has the leopard changed its spots? Is there any reason for thinking that when they say that there's no need to fear, that they ought to be listened to, or is that just nonsense?
Eric and I were slightly disagreeing on this possibly before the show, but I think it would be largely historically and religiously illiterate to assume that there will be some radical change in the way that a regime led by the Taliban would function over a period of time. I think there's a question as to how they might deal with Western governments in a more pragmatic way or camera-facing way, as they have with the exit of British and American troops and civilians. But let's look at 2 years down the line. Are women going to be systematically raped and abused because they're of a religious minority, as we've seen in the past? Are we going to have public executions again? It really does remain to be seen, but it would somewhat counter what the Taliban say they believe about the centrality of Sharia law, for example, to act in a different way going forward.
Eric, in what way were you in mild disagreement with Ryan?
Well, I mean, I largely agree, and I think if you look at the doctrine, it is very intolerant and very patriarchal and misogynist and all the rest of it. So I'm not disagreeing with the risks. I guess I may be being a bit more hopeful in the sense that if you look at where we were in 1996 when the Taliban took over last time, there was a lot of energy behind the Islamic revival, and this idea of jihadism was new and fresh as a political force. Now, post-Al-Qaeda, post-ISIS, one gets the sense in the Middle East, at least that's my sense, is that this has really started to taper. You've had regimes like the former Tunisian nominally Islamist regime, but that was compatible with democracy to some degree. And even though I don't like Islamism, I mean, I think that there are some reasons to think that some of the energy behind. So if you look at the terrorism, the international terrorism, again, has tapered since the early 2000s. The hope there is, in a way, that the maturity of this, it's no longer the new kid on the block. People will be more jaded about it. And maybe the Taliban will pick up on those wider currents in the Middle East and maybe be influenced by them in a way to become less completely radical. Now, that just could be hope speaking, but I think things are not exactly the same as in 96. So.
You're nodding, Ryan, as though you can see a logic there that you could be simpatical with.
I think the logic there is just pragmatism on the part of the Taliban to be a successful regime under their own terms. I'm just reflecting on what you were saying at the start of the show, that the civilization we consider civilization now, the post-war human rights order, liberal democracies, it is a really delicate moment, an extraordinary moment in history. And most of human history and most of the world still today live under regimes that are far more like the Taliban than Britain. So we do have to be realistic about what we can affect. I really strongly believe, though, we should do the bare minimum that we say we stand for now. You were saying earlier, what do we say we represent anymore as the West? Well, we're at least saying in terms of legal international obligations, conventions, that we will secure protection for those minorities that are left in Afghanistan, regardless of whether we've tried to nation build in that country or not. If we think something that could look like a genocide or of a systematic persecution is about to occur, we do have duties to abide by on that very minimal standard of who we say we are.
Yeah, so I do agree with that, but I do think there are still questions at home. So even in the last few weeks, we've had this nationality and borders bill and a lot of rhetoric around cracking down on refugees and asylum seekers. And I do think even at home, there is this kind of sense of jadedness and not full comfortability with accepting huge numbers of people that people perceive as other in some way, racialised or religious or otherwise. So I do think that actually a conversation needs to be had, not just about how many numbers realistically, but what that means for British people here in terms of integration and ensuring that there's not kind of ghettoisation of new people coming here where practices from other countries are reproduced. You mentioned the Ahmadiyya community. There's actually been some persecution of Ahmadiyya Muslims in the UK. And so I think that all of these conversations, if it is to be something we do, have to be really honest about what's possible and how we make sure that it maintains a genuinely cohesive society.
I think there's no getting away from the fatigue that must be accepted across Europe and in Britain at the moment. Feelings are running very high about the numbers of people that are arriving, on the coastline, and it's surely a demonstration that governments and other bodies ought to have acted in a more authoritative way, because now, after watching thousands of people come, and Afghanistan happens. And now we have tens of thousands of people who everyone can see would be legitimately in fear of their lives, but they're on the border of a Europe that is fatigued already with the more chaotic immigration and asylum attempt that there has been. It's surely a lesson for all of the governments of Europe that they have to bear in mind that their people are tired, and legitimately so.
Well, yeah, and you saw that, by the way, if you looked at the announcement from Germany. They said they weren't going to do another Syria again. So that was a clear signal that, I mean, if you saw what happened last time with the migrant crisis, essentially populist right party support generally across Western Europe and Hungary and surged. And this introduced, the AfD in Germany, for example, who now is a party that has pretty solid representation as a minority in most of Germany, particularly the East, but not only. So I just think, there is that wariness now. But of course, we do have to get people out of harm's way. I mean, that's absolutely right.
But also, it's so often, it's communities within Britain and elsewhere, the communities that actually do the absorbing of the relocated people are often very different from the individuals that are calling for that relocation to happen. There's no getting away from the fact that, the people saying we must do this and we must do that, their lives are generally less affected and impacted, by the inevitable arrival of thousands of new people, often from faiths and cultures that are completely dislocated here.
But I just very quickly, though, I do think there is a distinction between getting people out of harm's way and resettling permanently, right? So you will have people who resettle permanently, and then you have to talk about things like refugee camps and facilities where people are safe. They're not great, right? But the question is our obligation to get people out of harm's way, or is it to resettle them permanently? And I do think those are two separate conversations, and they're often elided into one.
Is that legitimate, Ryan? Out of harm's way, but not necessarily permanently relocated?
Yeah, absolutely. But we failed to get people out of harm's way. Again, I'll go back to our most recent example with Daesh, ISIS in Syria and Iraq. the UN refugee camps there, again, because they wouldn't take religious affiliation as significant, you often had Christians and other Islamic minorities in camps with Sunni majority. And these people know each other. They're from the same communities. They feel incredibly vulnerable in these camps. And so what you found actually in practice is, whether it be permanent settlement or just temporary relocation, they didn't want to be there. So they would often escape to secret, I guess, church-based houses of refuge, where actually the refugee the refugee aid wasn't available to them because it doesn't fulfil the formal criteria. So even in terms of getting people out of harm's way temporarily, we've made a bit of a ham-fisted job of it in recent years, and I hope it isn't the same for Afghanistan.